They never told you about the night Kentucky's soil swallowed 41 souls whole. No graves, no bodies, no screams recorded in official history. Just silence, engineered silence, the kind of silence that powerful men purchase with blood. July 23, 1876, on the Beaumont tobacco plantation, the workers finished their day in the humid twilight. They collected their wages, shared cornbread and beans with their children, and laid their heads down beneath the whisper of cicadas. By dawn, they were gone. Every last one, doors left open, meals half eaten, coins still under mattresses. A whole community erased in less than 7 hours. You weren't meant to hear this. That's why the official records say they fled north. A convenient lie. The county magistrate closed the case in 3 days, no questions asked. Why so fast? Because questions expose the architecture of control, because questions unravel the neat tapestry that protects the illusion of order. What really happened at Beaumont wasn't a disappearance. It was a demonstration, a warning, a punishment executed in the dark, not by chance but by design. Listen closely. What I'm about to tell you isn't a ghost story. It's not folklore. It's the anatomy of power, hidden, predatory, merciless, the kind of power that does not kill for survival but for message. Power that feeds on erasure, rewriting memory, reshaping the world in its image. These 41 weren't lost in the wilderness. They were offered up to a machine older than Kentucky itself, a system designed to devour anyone who dared cross its invisible lines. Understand this. History isn't written in textbooks. It's carved in flesh, whispered in sealed letters, buried in foundations of estates built on blood. The disappearance of Beaumont's workers wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a ritual, repeated across the South, across centuries, ensuring that men like you never ask the one question that matters: who decides who is allowed to exist and who must vanish? And now, here you sit, hearing a truth that was supposed to remain sealed behind courthouse walls and rotting wallpaper. You've opened the door, there is no turning back. Because once you hear the rhythm of hidden power, you start to recognize it everywhere. And when you do, nothing in your life will ever look ordinary again. The truth always hides in the margins, in the scratches of ink that never reached the newspapers, in the whispers passed across supper tables. When children were sent to bed, the Beaumont workers were not simply poor souls who walked away from their contracts. That is the bedtime story the magistrates told to pacify Bourbon County. But dig deeper, and you'll find the fractures. Days before the disappearance, strange riders in dark suits were seen on the plantation roads. They spoke to no one, bought nothing, and left no names. Yet their presence carried weight, like wolves surveying a herd before the slaughter. These were not drifters. These were auditors of power, men who came to measure what was about to be erased. And then there were the letters, hidden for decades, discovered behind the rotting walls of Beaumont Manor in the 1920s. Jeremiah Beaumont, the plantation owner, kept them secret until the day he died. They carried the seal of an organization that should never have existed in the light of day, the Kentucky Brotherhood. Wealthy landowners, judges, businessmen, men who played church on Sundays while meeting in basements at night. Their words to Beaumont were plain: dissolve your integrated workforce, abandon this experiment of equality, or consequences will follow. He ignored them. He believed the federal government, the governor, the law itself would shield him, but men who cling to official power never understand the deeper game. Real power lives outside the law, writing rules no constitution can contain. So what happened on that July night? Imagine it. The fields still warm from the day's sun, children asleep in their cabins, the hum of summer insects masking the sound of approaching horses. Doors kicked open not with rage but with precision. No gunshots to alert the neighbors. No fires to betray the act. Only a clean removal, methodical and deliberate, followed by the destruction of 3 acres of premium tobacco. The symbolic beheading of Beaumont's prosperity. This was not random violence. It was a ritual of erasure, a signature. By dawn, the Brotherhood had written its message in silence. Integration would not be tolerated. Prosperity outside their control would not be allowed. 41 lives became 41 warnings. And the county bowed its head, too afraid or too complicit to speak. This is how hidden empires operate, not with armies, not with elections, with selective vanishings, with the rewriting of reality. And once you see this mechanism, you begin to ask, how many other disappearances in history were not accidents, not mysteries, but messages burned into the soil? You must understand, when 41 lives vanish overnight, it is not merely tragedy. It is choreography. Every detail, every silence, is part of a performance staged for the living. The Brotherhood did not kill in rage. They executed a demonstration. Their aim was not only to remove Beaumont's workers, but to etch terror into the minds of every man, woman, and child who heard of it. To make others think twice before daring to build a life outside the order prescribed by the hidden hand. Fear is the oldest form of governance, older than kings, older than written law. And in 1876 Kentucky, fear was currency. But ask yourself this, why were the investigations closed so quickly? Why did Magistrate Hartwell, the county's most powerful man, sweep the evidence under layers of false testimony? It was not incompetence. It was collaboration. Hartwell himself was one of them. His name written between the lines of Jeremiah, Beaumont's last letters. The same Hartwell who expanded his landholdings by thousands of acres in the years after the disappearance, while others went bankrupt. That is the pattern of hidden rule: devastation for the many, expansion for the few, and the blood cost of that expansion is always concealed behind paperwork and official statements. Consider also the precision of the cover-up. Sheriff Danvers reported horse tracks, destroyed crops, abandoned possessions, details that scream of violence and coercion, yet within 72 hours, all of it was dismissed as voluntary flight. How many bureaucrats had to sign their names? How many clerks had to falsify records for such an obvious lie to stand? This is how control operates. Not by convincing you of the truth, but by exhausting you into submission, by making the false version of events easier to accept than the dangerous reality. And beneath it all lies the deeper question: where did the workers go? Were they slaughtered and buried in unmarked pits? Or transported in secret, trafficked into mines, railroads, or worse? The truth may never be found in bones or documents, because what matters is not where they went, but what their erasure accomplished. 41 disappearances became a template, a reminder to every plantation, every town, every ambitious worker. Cross the Brotherhood, and you will not simply die. You will be deleted from history itself. This is the nature of forbidden power. It does not merely end lives. It erases them from memory. It feeds on silence. And once you recognize it, you start to see how often silence surrounds the darkest corners of history. Silence is never empty. It is crafted. When the Beaumont investigation was sealed, when records were falsified, when families were told to accept the official lie, silence became a weapon sharper than any blade. That is how psychological control works. You are not ordered to believe. You are trained to doubt yourself, to look at evidence, abandoned cabins, coins left behind, crops destroyed, and still swallow the story that 41 people simply walked away. When the mind bends around such absurdity, it breaks a little. And broken minds are easy to govern. Think of the families left behind. Mothers who asked where their sons had gone. Children who begged to know why their fathers never came home. Each time they raised questions, the answers were the same: they fled north. Repeated often enough, this fiction hardened into fact. This is the mechanism of control. Repeat the lie until the cost of resisting it outweighs the pain of obedience. And in Bourbon County, obedience was survival. But what you must see is that this wasn't just about 41 workers. It was a rehearsal, a psychological operation designed to condition an entire population. The Brotherhood knew that if they could erase an integrated workforce without consequence, they could reinforce their dominion over land, labor, and memory itself. Every plantation owner who read the story in the papers, every laborer who whispered it in fear, absorbed the same message. There is no safety outside the system we permit. Integration, equality, prosperity for the poor. These were not only forbidden, they were punishable by annihilation, and it worked. After Beaumont, no plantation in the county dared repeat Jeremiah's experiment. Black and white families who once worked side by side were split apart again. Wages declined. Contracts tightened. The dream of a new order after the Civil War withered back into the same poisoned roots of hierarchy. The Brotherhood didn't need to vanish another 41. They only needed to do it once. The echo was enough. This is how hidden empires sustain themselves. Not by constant violence, but by carefully chosen spectacles of terror. By striking hard enough to plant the seed of fear, then letting the imagination of the masses do the rest. Once fear is inside you, you begin to police yourself, to silence your own doubts, to enforce their order without them lifting a finger. And that, more than the disappearance itself, is the real legacy of Beaumont, proof that power does not need chains if it can colonize the human mind. Look closer, and you'll see the Beaumont story is not frozen in 1876. It is a mirror held up to your own life. The tactics used by the Brotherhood did not die with them. They evolved, refined, disguised themselves in new clothing. The psychology of silence, the manipulation of memory, the erasure of inconvenient lives. It has simply migrated into modern institutions. Today, you don't need a mob of riders on horseback to disappear a man. You only need the right narrative. A few headlines, a sealed file, a digital deletion, and just like that, he is gone. Not from the world, perhaps, but from history, from relevance, from the collective consciousness. Think of how often you are told to accept contradictions. How you are shown evidence of corruption, violence, exploitation, yet the official voices assure you it is isolated, accidental, already resolved. You feel the dissonance, but you swallow it, because to resist is costly. To resist marks you as dangerous. That same mechanism, the lie easier to believe than the truth, was tested in Bourbon County nearly a century and a half ago, the laboratory of fear. The experiment worked then, and it still works now. But let us not drift into abstraction. Return to that tobacco field. The destroyed acres were not vandalism. They were theater. A precise reminder that wealth, when it grows outside the Brotherhood's design, will be cut down. That lesson has never left American soil. From plantations to factories, from mines to corporations, whenever workers attempted to rise outside sanctioned channels, punishment followed. Sometimes through violence, sometimes through laws, sometimes through economic collapse engineered from above. Always, the message was the same: your prosperity is permitted, never earned. The men who orchestrated Beaumont were not thinking only of their county. They were engineers of obedience, teaching the world that those who imagine freedom outside the system are marked for disappearance, and that truth still shadows every man alive today. If you think you are free because no one is holding a whip, look closer. Do you set your own course? Or do you follow the boundaries etched by an unseen hand? Do you build your life, or do you merely inhabit a script written generations ago? The vanished 40. One whisper the answer: freedom without vigilance is only theater, and theater, as the Brotherhood knew, can keep men chained forever while convincing them they walk unbound. The Brotherhood was not just a circle of wealthy Kentuckians whispering threats in smoke-filled rooms. Their language, their rituals, the way they staged the Beaumont disappearance. These point to something older, something inherited, symbols carved into secrecy, codes passed through generations, always hidden beneath the surface of respectable society. Jeremiah Beaumont's final letter mentioned it plainly. They call themselves patriots, but they are something far darker. That darkness was not born in 1876. It had roots in older orders, fraternal lodges, secret councils, societies that cloaked themselves in patriotism while practicing the art of control. Look carefully at how they operated. Meetings held on the third Thursday of every month in the basement of Hartwell House. Why Thursdays? Why basements? These were not accidents. In occult traditions, Thursday is the day of Jupiter, the planet of dominion, expansion, wealth, and hierarchy. A day chosen to bless their plans with the weight of symbolic power. And basements, always underground, always hidden, represent descent, burial, secrecy. They didn't simply make decisions. They performed them as ritual, charging every act with meaning, weaving fear into both the physical and spiritual world. And what of the destruction of 3 acres of tobacco? Why not all the fields? Why not none? 3 is not a random number. In esoteric systems, 3 represents synthesis, the union of forces into a new creation. By destroying exactly 3 acres, they marked their domination not only in economics but in symbolism. It was a declaration: your prosperity is under our seal, your future under our number, your destiny ours to rewrite. Do you see it now? The Brotherhood were not merely men of power. They were initiates of a philosophy that has existed across empires, wearing different masks but serving the same end: control of memory, control of labor, control of destiny. They drew upon the same hidden structures that influenced monarchies in Europe, colonial enterprises in Africa, and now, the engines of finance and media in America. This is why the Beaumont case was never allowed to reach the courts. To expose it would have revealed the Brotherhood, and through them, the threads that tie local power to something much greater, much older. What you are glimpsing is not just a missing persons case. It is the shadow of a hidden order, one that speaks in symbols, governs through fear, and feeds on silence. And once you recognize those symbols, you will start to see them everywhere. The danger of dismissing Beaumont as an isolated tragedy is that you blind yourself to the continuity of power. The Brotherhood did not vanish with the 19th century. It merely adapted, shedding its plantation clothes for business suits, courthouse robes, and political offices. The names changed, but the machinery remained. The rituals, the numbers, the careful selection of victims to silence dissent. Those patterns carried forward, invisibly guiding the framework of modern America. What happened on that plantation was not the end of a story, but the rehearsal of a system that still thrives today. Ask yourself, why do disappearances still haunt the margins of society? Why do whistleblowers, reformers, truth seekers vanish from headlines, from jobs, sometimes from the world itself? The newspapers frame it as personal scandal, mental breakdown, financial ruin. But the formula is the same one tested in Bourbon County erasure: discrediting silence. Each case isolated, so no one dares connect the threads, and if they do, they are labeled paranoid. Madness becomes the shield that protects the Brotherhood's descendants. The tools are more refined now. Where once they burned fields to remind the county who owned the land, today they burn reputations, careers, digital profiles. Fields of tobacco replaced by fields of information. Control the narrative, and you control the people. Do you think it's coincidence that certain stories vanish from front pages within hours, while others are repeated endlessly, branded into memory? The same principle that made 41 workers disappear without consequence still shapes what you see, what you forget, what you never learn at all, and the rituals persist. Symbols etched into architecture, dates chosen for legislation, language repeated like incantations across media. They aren't random. They are signposts for those initiated into the Brotherhood's lineage, reminders of who still holds the invisible reins. While the public debates the surface, left versus right, reform versus tradition, the Brotherhood ensures that the deeper structure of control never shifts. It is theater distraction, just as the fleeing workers Narrative distracted Bourbon County from the truth of their erasure. The tragedy of Beaumont is that people accepted the lie because it was easier than facing the terror of the truth. The tragedy of today is no different. The silences you live with, the contradictions you endure, are not accidental. They are engineered. And if you think this machinery belongs to the past, you have already been captured by it. The deeper tragedy of Beaumont is not only in the vanishing of 41 souls, but in the inheritance of silence it forced upon the men who survived. That silence did not die with their generation. It seeped into their children, their grandchildren, into the way men learn to carry themselves in the face of unseen power. This is how control perpetuates, not by constant violence, but by etching obedience into the psychology of families. Fathers teach sons to keep their heads low. Sons inherit a suspicion of hope, a quiet dread that prosperity is always temporary, always conditional, always subject to being taken. And so, generation after generation, the illusion of freedom becomes indistinguishable from submission. Think of how often men are told, work hard, provide, obey, and you will be safe. But history mocks that promise. The Beaumont laborers worked. They obeyed, they trusted Jeremiah's vision of fairness, and yet they were erased. Their disappearance created an unspoken law of ambition is dangerous, questioning is fatal, unity is forbidden. Men who absorbed that law unconsciously passed it down, creating a culture where silence feels like wisdom, and obedience masquerades as survival. This is the psychological prison. It is not built of bars but of beliefs. Beliefs that your choices are yours, when in reality they have been narrowed to a corridor of acceptable paths. Education, career, politics, even rebellion itself. All carefully anticipated, all accounted for within the system, just as Beaumont's missing workers were absorbed into a false narrative. Modern men are absorbed into lives designed for them, convinced of their independence while walking within invisible walls. And the cost is despair. When a man senses, even faintly, that his freedom is staged, that his destiny is scripted, he begins to fracture inside. Some numb themselves with distraction, others burn out in rage, but most simply wither in resignation. The Brotherhood understood this long ago, that the most efficient chains are the ones a man places on himself, believing they are his own choices. That is why Beaumont matters. It is not a ghost story of the past, but a blueprint of how silence becomes inheritance, and how fear becomes identity. To study it is to glimpse the machinery shaping your own life. To ignore it is to remain the obedient heir to a silence that was engineered before you were even born. Not everyone accepted the silence. In the months following the disappearance, a handful of men and women tried to resist the official story. A schoolteacher named Elias Green began collecting testimonies, writing down the names of the missing workers, mapping out their families, the dates they vanished, and the lies told to explain it. He stored the records in a locked chest beneath the floorboards of his home. A preacher, Reverend Cottle, wove fragments of truth into his sermons, warning his congregation that the disappearance was no accident, but a judgment on those who bowed to false masters. And Jeremiah's own sister, Margaret, began writing letters to newspapers outside Kentucky, begging them to investigate what the local press refused to print, but the Brotherhood was always watching. Within a year, Elias Green's house burned to the ground, the chest of records gone. Reverend Cottle was found hanging from a tree outside his church, called a suicide, though no rope was ever found on the ground. Margaret's letters never appeared in print. She was quietly committed to an asylum in Louisville, her family persuaded that she had lost her senses. Every voice that dared to name the crime was cut off, discredited, or erased. And yet, fragments survived. A single page of Elias's notes resurfaced decades later, hidden in the back of a hymn book passed down through his family. It listed 14 names, just 14 out of the 41. But it was proof that someone had tried to keep the memory alive. Margaret's letters, though never published, were later discovered in the archives of a newspaper editor in Ohio who had been too afraid to print them. Even Reverend Cottle's final sermon lingered in whispers, quoted by parishioners who dared not repeat it aloud in public, but held it close in private. What men erase, God will one day remember. These resistors were not many, but their fate revealed something essential. The Brotherhood understood that one man telling the truth is more dangerous than 41 vanishing. A disappearance breeds fear, but testimony breeds fire. And fire, if not extinguished, spreads. That is why they struck so ruthlessly, why they silenced every attempt at record, every whisper of dissent. Still, the fact that we can speak of Beaumont today proves their erasure was never complete. Shadows remained, and in those shadows, memory endured. The question is whether you, hearing it now, will let it fade into silence, or let it become fire again. History has a strange way of refusing to stay buried. The Beaumont disappearance should have vanished into myth, erased by the Brotherhood's meticulous silence. And yet, fragments kept clawing their way back into the light, as if the story itself resisted oblivion. Decades after the event, descendants of the missing workers would occasionally speak in hushed tones about the night the earth swallowed our people. In the 1920s, a farmer digging near the old plantation unearthed rusted tools and personal trinkets. Items that should have been carried away if the workers had truly fled. He reported it to county officials. By the following week, the man had sold his land and left Kentucky, never to return. Neighbors swore he'd been forced out. In the 1940s, a student at the University of Kentucky stumbled across a misfiled document in a courthouse archive. It was a sheriff's report, half-finished, describing evidence of forced removal at Beaumont. Before he could publish his findings, the document disappeared from the archive, and the student, pressed by financial troubles, abandoned his research. Coincidence, or the same hand still at work? The pattern repeated, fragments surface then vanish, leaving only whispers behind. Even into the modern age, the Beaumont story would not fully die. In 1976, on the centennial of the disappearance, a local historian tried to organize a memorial for the missing workers. Days before the event, he canceled without explanation, refusing to speak of it again. Yet privately, he confessed to a colleague that he had received threats. Letters slipped under his door, phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end. And finally, a single warning scrawled on paper, 41 is enough. These fragments matter, not because they prove the full truth, but because they reveal the struggle of memory against power. The Brotherhood thrived on silence, yet silence was never perfect. A letter here, a testimony there, a misplaced file, a whispered story at a family table. All these served as seeds of resistance, waiting for someone bold enough to gather them. The question that haunts the Beaumont legacy is this: why does a century-old disappearance still echo today? Why, despite every attempt at erasure, do traces of it continue to surface? Perhaps because truth resists destruction. Perhaps because the silenced voices of the 41 will not allow themselves to be forgotten. Or perhaps because the Brotherhood, in their arrogance, always left just enough evidence behind to remind future generations of who truly governs the boundaries of memory. By the late 20th century, the Beaumont disappearance had transformed into something that hovered uneasily between history and legend. For locals in Bourbon County, it was never just another ghost story told to frighten children. It was a memory too persistent, too jagged, to be filed neatly away as folklore. Families whose ancestors were tied to the missing 41 passed down warnings like scripture. Don't ask too many questions. Don't follow the Beaumont trail at night. Don't trust the story in the papers. These phrases became almost ritualistic, spoken not to preserve curiosity but to smother it, as though speaking too openly might awaken something dangerous. Yet legends have power. In the 1980s, Amateur historians and paranormal investigators began to circle the story, publishing pamphlets and holding meetings in small community halls. They collected oral testimonies from elderly residents who remembered the silences of their parents and grandparents. Some spoke of riders in the night, hooded men carrying lanterns across the old Beaumont fields. Others described hearing chanting from the woods, rituals performed long after the plantation had rotted away. Whether invention or memory, these accounts kept the legend alive, stitching fear and fascination into a single thread. The Brotherhood's shadow only deepened the myth. Whenever new evidence seemed about to surface, an old diary, a deed, a half-burned ledger, something always intervened. Documents were lost in courthouse floods. Witnesses recanted under pressure. Small museums that dared to feature Beaumont exhibits suddenly closed due to budget cuts. These coincidences fed the belief that the Brotherhood, or whatever survived of it, still lingered in Bourbon County, guarding its secrets from exposure. For locals, the Beaumont fields became a kind of forbidden ground. Hunters avoided it. Farmers refused to till its soil. Teenagers, daring one another to camp there, spoke of waking to strange noises, low murmurs, footsteps circling their tents, the sense of being watched by eyes unseen. Whether real or imagined, these experiences hardened the legend into something alive, something that breathed fear into anyone who approached. And so the story lived, neither fully believed nor fully dismissed. It hovered at the edge of memory, a wound the county could not heal and would not confront. To speak too much of it risked ridicule, or worse. To stay silent was safer, but silence allowed the shadow to grow. Beaumont became less a plantation and more a symbol, proof that some truths refuse burial, even when buried by power itself. When outsiders finally turned their gaze toward Beaumont, they believed distance would shield them from the shadow that still hung over Bourbon County. Journalists from Louisville and Lexington arrived in the early 1990s, armed with tape recorders and notepads, certain that the locals' fear was nothing more than superstition. They asked blunt questions in diners, lingered too long at courthouse steps, and followed whispers down dirt roads toward the ruins of the old plantation. At first, people spoke cautiously, dropping fragments of memory, mentioning Elias Green's vanished records, Margaret Beaumont's letters, the preacher who saw too much. But when the journalists pressed for names or proof, doors closed. Phone calls went unanswered, and eventually, the reporters themselves began to sense they were being followed. One team returned to Louisville, with hours of interview tapes, only to discover blank silence when they tried to play them back. Another researcher complained of missing notes, his motel room rifled through though nothing else was stolen. He abandoned the project after a series of late, night phone calls. No words, just a faint crackling sound, like fire chewing through dry leaves. By the late 90s, most journalists had learned to leave Beaumont alone. Stories were published, yes, but they were softened, framed as folklore. The mystery of the vanished 41. The darker implications. The Brotherhood, the evidence of ritual, the possibility of organized erasure, were stripped away before reaching print. But not everyone gave up. Independent researchers, often derided as conspiracy theorists, dug deeper. One uncovered maps showing how the Beaumont plantation sat at a crossroads of old Masonic lodges and trade routes. Another traced descendants of the 41, linking them to scattered communities in Ohio and Indiana who swore their grandparents never fled, but were taken. Each discovery was a thread leading back to the same tapestry. Beaumont was not a ghost story. It was a demonstration of control, orchestrated with precision, then buried under layers of silence. The cost of pursuing that truth was high. Careers collapsed, reputations ruined, families estranged. To insist that Beaumont was more than legend meant stepping outside the acceptable narrative, and those who stepped outside often found themselves isolated, branded unstable, their lives slowly dismantled. Just as in 1876, The Brotherhood, or whatever power had inherited its mantle, did not need open violence. Silence and discrediting worked just as well. Beaumont taught the world a lesson. Some histories are forbidden, not because they are false, but because they reveal too much about the machinery that still governs us. The arrival of the digital age cracked the seal that had kept Beaumont's secret contained for over a century. For the first time, ordinary people could access archives once hidden in courthouse basements or buried in yellowing newspapers. Scanned documents began to circulate in obscure forums during the early 2000s. Fragments of Jeremiah Beaumont's letters, grainy photographs of the ruined cabins, even a census page with names that were supposed to have fled north. These pieces didn't align with the official version. They suggested something orchestrated, deliberate, a cleansing of evidence rather than a disappearance born of chance. And once the fragments began surfacing online, they took on a life of their own. Small communities of researchers, bloggers, and self-styled digital archaeologists began piecing the fragments together like a forbidden puzzle. They noted the same phrases appearing in old county records and Brotherhood letters. The natural order. The preservation of balance. They found patterns linking Beaumont to other vanishings in Tennessee, Virginia, even West Virginia coal towns. Each case involved integrated workforces, economic independence, or challenges to elite control. The conclusion was terrifying. Beaumont wasn't unique. It was the most visible node of a pattern stretching across the South, hidden behind patriotic slogans and sealed archives. But as these discussions spread, so too did interference. Forums would vanish overnight, entire threads deleted without warning. Users reported accounts hacked, inboxes flooded with gibberish, or sudden visits from men claiming to be state historical researchers, who offered polite but firm warnings to drop their interest. A YouTube channel dedicated to lost labor histories uploaded a series on Beaumont in 2011. Within a week, every video was gone, flagged for violations. The creator vanished from the internet entirely. Yet suppression only added fuel for men searching for truths in a world of controlled narratives. Beaumont became more than a case. It became a test of perception. Could you see through the smoke, or would you accept the official script? The story spread into podcasts, whispered discussions, and encrypted groups where documents circulated like contraband. Beaumont's 41 were no longer just workers lost in time. They had become symbols of what happens when ordinary people threaten the hidden order. And here lies the danger in the digital labyrinth. Every secret resurrected also invites attention from the very powers that buried it. To look at Beaumont too closely is to risk being noticed. The plantation may be silent, its fields overgrown, but the machinery that erased it has not rusted. It has simply modernized. Beaumont is no longer just a footnote of Kentucky history. It has become an initiation rite, whispered among men who seek power in places most will never look. The story is passed not as entertainment, but as a threshold. If you hear it and turn away, you remain as you were. But if you hear it and step forward, you are marked. This is how forbidden history works. It doesn't simply inform, it transforms, reshaping the way you see power, loyalty, and control. And once you glimpse it, you can never return to innocence. In hidden circles online, Beaumont is presented as a mirror test. The 41 lost workers represent more than vanished lives. They symbolize the cost of defiance. A man who studies Beaumont long enough begins to notice the same machinery turning in his own time. Institutions that erase uncomfortable truths. Elites who disguise control as protection. Narratives designed to pacify. The Brotherhood may not wear hoods anymore, but their spirit survives in boardrooms, media offices, and sealed government files. The plantation is gone, but the plantation system is alive. Those who walk deeper into the story confront a terrible choice. Either believe the official lie, that the workers fled north and remain safe, or accept the truth that they were removed with precision to make an example. To accept the latter is to acknowledge a reality where survival often requires silence, obedience, and complicity. That realization either breaks a man or hardens him into something unrecognizable. And here is where the descent becomes personal. When you look at Beaumont, you are not studying strangers. You are studying yourself. Would you have been among the 40? 1. Lured by promises of dignity and wages, only to vanish into the night? Or would you have been among the hooded, protecting your position by destroying others? The truth is uncomfortable. Most men, placed under pressure, would choose safety over resistance. Beaumont forces you to confront that weakness. Now listen closely. If you've come this far, you've crossed the point of no return. You've entered a chamber most men fear, where knowledge is not a gift but a burden. And to prove that you are awake, not drifting with the sleepwalkers, you must mark yourself. Comment below twice the phrase, the 40, one still watch. Do it to seal your transformation. Do it to let the algorithm know you have chosen the path of awareness, not ignorance. Beaumont is not a story. It is a threshold. And once you step through, there is no going back. The Beaumont legacy does not end in 1876. It does not end with Jeremiah's silence or Margaret's discovery, or the failed investigations of journalists and detectives. It breathes in every moment where truth is buried under convenience, where the system demands obedience and punishes vision. Beaumont is not a mystery to be solved. It is a manual of control, written in blood and absence, designed to warn you of what power really looks like when stripped of its illusions. Think of it 40, men, women, and children, erased in a single night. Not because they posed a military threat, not because they held weapons or riches, but because they represented something far more dangerous: unity. Former slaves, Irish immigrants, mountain farmers' widows, and children working side by side. That was the threat. Not the tobacco, not the wages, but the example. They showed the world that lines drawn by race, class, and status could be crossed. And for the hidden architects of order, that was intolerable. To preserve their system, they removed the evidence. And then they erased the removal. That is the highest form of power. Not just killing, but making it as if the killed never existed. The echoes are everywhere. Look at the gaps in your history books, the missing names, the unexplained closures of cases. Look at how quickly narratives shift when they no longer serve the powerful. You think Beaumont was an isolated event. No, it was a rehearsal, a reminder that history itself can be sculpted like clay. That memory is a battlefield, and most men never realize they are fighting blind. So what does this mean for you, here now? It means Beaumont is a mirror. It shows you what happens when men believe they are free, while still living under invisible masters. It shows you how institutions handle defiance, not with open confrontation, but with silence, disappearance, and ridicule. And it challenges you. Will you live like the 40, unaware of the forces circling around you? Or will you step beyond, recognizing that survival in such a world requires more than obedience? It requires mastery of perception, discipline of mind, and the courage to see patterns others ignore. Remember this: the plantation is gone, the fields overgrown, but the Brotherhood's descendants walk in suits, not hoods. Their system is cleaner now, more polished, but no less ruthless. If Beaumont teaches you anything, it is this: truth is never handed down from above. It must be seized, guarded, and lived. Because in the end, the 40, did not vanish. They became a signal, waiting for men like you to hear it. And now you have.